Why do you write poems when death is all around us? Because when I was your age, the fighters in my family who would have taught me otherwise fell asleep beneath a heavy black shroud. Because after that, the only person who would share their food with me happened to be a poet, so I'm kind of just stuck, which is probably why most people write poems in the first place. Why do you write poems when death is all around us? Because my eyesight isn't very good. And that makes for a short lived mercenary or militia fighter, but it's perfect for an artist because I can't see the audience well enough to get nervous. Why do you write poems when death is all around us? Because even if I didn't, if I were the greatest swordsman on this moon, all rippling muscles and whirling blades, death would still be all around us. You can't beat death. You can only dance a little more slippery, drum a little more timelessly, hold that note beyond your breath and hope to find a home in its echo. Why do you write poems when death is all around us? Because I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of small talk. And it is far easier to read a poem at a funeral or a riot or a party or a revolution than it is to have a conversation with another person because I am a coward. But learned very early that cowardice is not always a bad thing. Why do you write poems when death is all around us? Because of simple mathematics, right? With a blade in my hand, what are my odds against a hungry bandit? With a poem on my tongue, though, maybe I can visit a village and make a child laugh. Maybe that child then sleeps through the night with no nightmares. Maybe his older sister then also sleeps through the night because she doesn't have to wake up to comfort her brother. Maybe then, later in the day, she will go for a walk by the river instead of taking a nap. Maybe she will discover a secret bloom of mushrooms and the whole village will have a great feast. Maybe a man who in another story would have been a hungry bandit, attends that feast, eats until he is full, and dances until he is delirious. And look at me, I've killed a bandit. Simple mathematics. Why do you write poems when death is all around us? Because I too dream of escape and know that escapism offers none. Only its outline in silver because I am not strong enough to tear these walls down, but I can still write my name on them because my name is a spell, a magic the wall cannot rationalize, a fault line through its face. With this name, I summon myself. With these poems, I summon something greater than myself, the splitting of a cell in the darkness, the new growth, the promise of a billion bricks bursting. Why do you write poems when death is all around us? Because death is all around us. Because life is all around us. So when death comes, let it come, let it step over this tripwire tongue, paint over every poem. My heaven has always been a blank page, so let death make one of me. Until then, I will write. For myself, for my ancestors, I will write for the whisper of a possibility that it might matter, for the fun of it if it doesn't. Look around us. Look all around us. How every poem, every song, every story pulls just a bit more at that shroud. Don't you want to see what's underneath? So like I said, I wanted to start with like a big loud poem just so that when this video exists later as just a video and not as a live, there's something interesting for people to watch. But it's a little awkward. I wasn't sure if we were actually live or not, but it seems like we are. I see some comments in the comment box. What's up, Seymour Perspective? I thought you might like that poem. Yeah. And I think, I'm just going to hang out for the next, 45 minutes or so. And as people come in and come out, it's all good. If you have to leave, this video I think will still exist later. If you come late, that's okay too. For the most part, it's really just to preview this new book that I've been working on over the past 2-3 years that is coming out in March. It's called Not a Lot of Reasons to Sing, But Enough. And we're also going to unveil or reveal the cover of that book tonight, which I'm super excited about because the cover is absolutely gorgeous. Um, But yeah, how's it going? Feel free to say what's up in the chat box. This I do have the comments on one side of my screen and other stuff happening elsewhere. And I've come from a I was gonna say pedagogical, but like just like a background where I don't like to just talk for an hour straight. I like to have it be a little more interactive and conversational, but I also don't want to put pressure on anybody on a Wednesday night. But yeah, I think we can talk a little bit. I'll share a few poems. We'll reveal the cover. Um, I will go ahead and throw into the chat box for the few of us who are here already um, the link if anyone is interested in pre-ordering the book. that if that works. Oh yeah, okay, they're populated. Oh, so I see this was all gonna be about like revealing the cover, and then when I put the link in the chat box, it kind of shows you what the cover is, but that's okay. That's a special preview for the 50 people or so who were like on time or early or whatever. You get to see the cover even earlier than everybody else. But yeah, thanks for showing up. It says my FPS is too low, but I don't think that's really a problem. I'm just gonna ignore that. But yeah, let me know if the audio needs any tweaking or if the video or whatever. And yeah, I think I'll just get right into it, talk about the book a little bit. Hey, Dan. Um, so yeah, this is a very different book. The metaphor that I use in the book, actually, in like kind of the afterward section, is that if my first book, for those of you who have read that, is kind of like a mixtape, and that it's just a bunch of random stuff just kind of mashed together, that this book is definitely more of an album. And that whole like mixtape album thing, like I don't know if people still think like that, but or if that's like a generationally specific thing. But I remember, particularly in hip hop, like mixtapes being kind of a collection of cool songs, and it might be really really good, but albums are supposed to be more like an event, like it has this like cohesive thread running through it, even if it's not a complete like concept album like a Deltron or whatever. There's still something cohesive about it. In this book, let me just read the blurb really quick for people who haven't had a chance to see that yet. This is like the official blurb. So Kyle Tranmyre's Not a Lot of Reasons to Sing, But Enough is a sci-fi flavored exploration of the role that art and artists play in resisting authoritarianism. Featuring new poems, theater elements, and Casper Faum's stunning visual art, the book follows two wandering poets as they make their way from village to village across a prison colony moon full of exiled rebels, robots, and storytellers. Part post-apocalyptic road journal, part alternate universe ode to hip-hop, and part letters to a young poet style toolkit for emerging poets and aspiring movement builders. It's also a one-of-a-kind practitioner's take on poetry, power, and possibility. Generally, I don't like to say that something is like one of a kind or unique, because there's always other stuff out there. But I think this book is pretty weird, if nothing else, and that's part of the reason I'm excited about it. If I were going to break down that blurb a little bit, I guess I would say, yeah, like I said, on one hand, it's a weird book. It's written entirely in character, or more specifically, in characters. So it's not like, hey, I'm Kyle, here's what I think about the world. It's a bunch of other people. And it takes place on a whole other world, actually, a moon. And it's full of all these like science fiction and fantasy trappings or tropes, I guess you could say. And that's just fun to me, and that there's so much room, I think, for poetry books as concept albums we talked about a second ago. Not just poems that like are collected around a theme, like in terms of their substance, but that maybe poetry books that have characters or have like a narrative running through them. I just think that kind of experimentation is like fun, and because I read and consume a lot of science fiction and fantasy myself, I just wanted to like lean into that, make the project as much fun as it could be, because part of like sustainability, whether you are an artist or an activist, is like trying to find the fun in things and the joy in things. I'll also say that that approach was never because I think it's a better way to write a poetry book. Like I think there are 1,000 valid ways to write poetry books. It's just something that I wanted to try. It was definitely a kind of write the thing that you wish you could read type of project. And so that's kind of like on the form level. But if we look at the content level, because form and content are not the exact same thing. I think on a content level, when you strip away the weirdness of the concept, it's actually a really down to earth book. It's a really, in some ways, a practical book. um, from the blurb, it's the idea that like the relationship between art and activism, the kind of the conversation between them. And I think more specifically, we could say that this book was written kind of in like a three bubble Venn diagram, in the middle of it, right? In one bubble is the pandemic. In one bubble is the uprising after the murder of George Floyd and all of the abolitionist organizing that happened, especially here in Minneapolis, but also around the country and around the world. And then the third bubble just being kind of the last couple years of the Trump administration. And of course, the book takes place on a whole other world, though. And so there are all these kind of layers of metaphor and symbol and kind of decontextualization or recontextualization, which again, I don't think is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just like one possible approach to writing about these issues. I love art that is super straightforward, and I love art that is super weird and outside the box. I think there's room for both. And so again, for me, because when you're talking about real world issues, but you're decontextualizing them, I think there's a danger in that, right? Like there's a danger in rubbing off all of the nuance. And so I was trying to think of an entry point into that. And what came to mind, and what ended up being kind of the central core of the book, is the idea of authoritarianism and the stories that we tell about authority and order, about power and punishment, about whose violence is considered a crime and whose violence is like completely invisible and like normalized. And also, on the positive side, about culture and collectivity and resistance. Like all of that kind of like bubble of different themes and ideas felt like an entry point, a way to approach the specific stuff that I usually write about. Where again, I'm not like I'm super famous or whatever, but if you know my work, you might know I write about like masculinity and whiteness and power and that kind of stuff. But all that felt like an entry point to talk about those same things, but in a very different way. Um, Hello from Seattle. Yeah, this is cool. Weird is a good way to get my attention. Yeah. Hey, what's up to John too? Thanks for. It's funny, like when you're not super famous, the people who show up to an event like this are like half people that you kind of know in real life and half people that like you've never met before, and like it's a good mix of people here. But yeah, and feel free if people have any questions, feel free to throw those in the chat box too. I'm kind of tracking that as I blah blah blah. Um, I would say just really quick, in terms of the pitch for the book, I think another really practical aspect of it is that because the conceit of the book is that it's these two poets, right? A robot kind of like master poet and their apprentice. And they travel from like village to village to village, and they share their poems, but then they also listen to the poems of the people who live in each village as they go. And so because the book is full of poems, but it's also full of like the conversations that happen around the poems and kind of the commentary on the poems from the characters, there's a lot of like, I would say, tools for people who are aspiring or emerging poets themselves. Um, or people who are like looking to sharpen their craft, right? And I think a lot of the book is full of like stuff I wish I knew when I was getting started, when I was 17 or 18 or whatever. Um, and it really speaks to the idea of spoken word, I think, not just as a thing people do, as like I write a poem and I say it out loud, but spoken word is kind of a cultural practice, as a deeper engagement with our communities and with our values and how we make them real in the world and all that kind of stuff. But that idea of passing on information, right? Like the only reason I've been able to do what I do is because I've had incredible people in my life, actual human beings who helped me and mentored me, and we'd get together and share poems with each other and feedback and critique each other and all that kind of stuff. And so I know a lot of people don't have that. And like one, find it, right? It could be a writing group at your school or a group of friends online who trade notes or whatever. But it could, I also wanted to put as much of it as I could in this book. Um, there's a chat. And again, some of this is really, really down to earth too, right? There's a whole kind of section in the book where the title I think is the three notes I share with literally 99% of the people who ask me for feedback on their poems. And like that part of the book isn't a poem. It's the character talking about how in every village that he visits, people want feedback on their poems, and he ends up giving the exact same feedback all the time. So it's kind of like, what are these like basic foundational tools that won't magically make any of us like brilliant, amazing poets, but like those foundational tools that can help kind of, I guess foundation is the word, like be a starting point or an entry point. Hey, Jonathan, what's up? Thank you for pre-ordering the book too. And then hello from Wisconsin. Um, I'm originally from Wisconsin. I was born in La Crosse and kind of moved around. But yeah, I'm in Minneapolis for anyone who did not know that already. And then there's one more thought I didn't note here that I wanted to share before we get into maybe another poem and then revealing the cover. And that again, on this topic of like what is the book about or like what is the book. Another big kind of central theme of the book is the idea that if you ever heard the nerdy thing to say, but if you ever listen to my TED talk, it kind of picks up on that. The idea that the process of writing poems, like the process of being a creative or a culture worker or an artist, that process, I think, mirrors the process of getting involved in activism for the first time. Because in the same way we talked about, a minute ago, there's all kinds of stuff in the book for like emerging or aspiring poets. There's also a lot of stuff for, at least in my head, emerging and aspiring activists, people who care about what's going on in the world, but just don't know how to plug in or haven't done that before. And I say aspiring very intentionally, and that's not necessarily youth. Like I think there is a big part of the book that is for young people because I work with young people, but I think we're all emerging. We're all aspiring writers, emerging activists, etc. But again, the idea in the book is that there's this connection about process. That in the same way that you sit down to write a poem, the same lessons that can be pulled from that process can, I think, illuminate the idea of getting involved and showing up and what that actually looks like for activists and movement builders too. Um, all right. Uptown Coffee, yeah. Definitely planning to come back. I have family in Marshfield, so I hope to be there sometime soon. But yeah, I thought, again, I'm not going to do 100 poems tonight. I'm just sharing kind of a little sneak preview of the book. I think over the next few months, because again, as someone said, March is kind of a long ways away. We'll be, releasing videos and images and all of the normal stuff you would for a book. But this is a special little preview, and I wanted to share at least a few poems here. And here's an example of a piece that, again, covers the same ground as pieces that I am more known for, like 10 responses to the phrase "man up" or like those types of poems, but does it from a completely different angle. Not because it's a better or worse approach, but just because it's something different. It's a shorter poem. It's called "Wolves," they said, prayer-like. And this is a reminder that all these poems are written from the perspective of like different characters in this book. And so this isn't like me talking. But again, let's call "Wolves," they said. That was the wrong tone for this poem. "Wolves," they said, prayer-like. It wasn't that the fence would cost too much or take too long to build. The men of the village just looked past us, past where the fence would be, into the great forest itself. "Wolves," they said, prayer-like. Night after night, packs of vicious wolves leave the cover of the great forest to raid the farms just outside the village, taking sheep and hogs, dozens of the beasts, stinking of blood, so large they'll look you straight in the eye. They come and they kill our sheep, our hogs, and they disappear back into that endless, whispering hell. We offered to start building the fence immediately, as this was still a relatively new settlement and our bosses figured they could curry favor with the people here by providing some basic protection. We knew right away, though, as our proposal hung in the air around the bonfire, these men would politely but firmly decline. We'd seen it before, this hunger. These men, always men, carrying their grandfather's swords, brittle from the rejection of their own softness. They didn't want to prevent the wolves from taking their livestock. They wanted to punish them. They would form hunting parties. They would sharpen spears and string bows, both useless in woods that dense, and these men would march straight into the darkness. The root of this kind of zealotry is always a story. Sometimes it's a story about how men are strong and strength always wins. Sometimes it's a story about how men are weak but can become strong through suffering. Sometimes it's a story about how terrifying it is to be alone and how important it is to go along. It's never a story anyone actually tells. It lives like a parasite in the margins of other stories, innocent stories of adventure and escapism of men, always men, overcoming long odds, winning through sheer force of will and righteousness, men killing their enemies. The stories are tricks. The hardest man is softer than a dull blade, a shovel, a mouthful of teeth. Rugged becomes ragged so easily. Strong becomes inflexible. Tough becomes gristle. A single-minded enemy is easy to predict, to hunt. All these qualities we see as weapons, they're just weight. No use in the brush we move through. Too many men see wolf and think dog. Think weak, familiar creature that cowers to a raised voice. Too many men see ourselves and think wolf. Taste the blood between our teeth and assume it once belonged to prey. So yeah, again, it's a book that tackles very real world issues, and the ones that are important to me and the ones that I write about a lot, but it's through the lens of this completely imaginary society that kind of is a weird amalgam of like sci-fi stuff like robots and spaceships, but also kind of fantasy stuff. Like it's a pre-industrial society that just happens to have robots because they're all exiled from this planet. It's a prison colony moon full of people who've been exiled from this planet. And so like the poem itself is very much about, obviously masculinity. It's also about abolition, the idea of prevention versus punishment, and how much energy is put towards one instead of the other. And also about like counter narrative, all the stuff about story, like as Seymour said, like the idea of stories that live like parasites in the margins of other stories. And again, like you won't hear those terms in the poem itself, right? The whole book is, again, it's about like toxic masculinity and white supremacy and capitalism and all this stuff, but you don't hear those specific words. Now, I know I've said this a couple of times already, but it's because I'm really self-conscious about it. I'm going to say it again. It's not because I think that's a better approach to writing about these issues. It's just that I've already written the more kind of straightforward poems, like 10 responses to the phrase man up, or how to explain white supremacy to a white supremacist, or consent at 10,000 feet. Like, those, I appreciate the process of writing those poems, but I think it was healthy for me as a poet and as a person to like just do something different, like to try to stretch my brain a little bit. And I think that's one important function of poetry, is how do you take something that you think you already understand and like put a new light on it, or look at it from just a little bit different of an angle. I think that's such like a healthy, important challenge. So thank you for listening to that. Let's see. I'm gonna do the cover reveal in a second and start to show off some artwork from the book. But yeah, any thoughts, questions before we keep moving? Oh, there's one. I struggle turning ideas into poems. Any tips on note taking? It's funny. So like there is stuff in the book about that. Like there's a whole section where like the two characters visit a school and answer like some questions, and some of that stuff comes out. There are different kind of like panel discussions of these imaginary writers like talking to each other, and some of them are full of it, right? And like that's part of the fun, is that there's a lot of satire and sarcasm in the book. But in terms of that specific question, I mean, we can sit with that for a second. It's only 25 after. Obviously there's no one answer to that question, and there are a million different approaches. I would say that for me, the most useful way that I've struggled with that same thing, or the most useful thing that I've done in that same position, is when you have an idea but don't know how to turn it into a poem, it's just, it's an imaging exercise where I take the big like concept or the idea that I want to write about, and I try to just zoom in and 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 zoom in until it's something really small, right? And some of that's easier said than done. Some of that is obvious, but I think just that mindset of going from, I want to write about the climate crisis because the climate crisis is like the most important thing in the history of humanity, and like all of our policy and attention and art should be, not all of it, but like there should be policy and attention and art focused on doing something about it. But that's hard then, right? Because the climate crisis is so big. If I just stand up on a stage and I'm like, hey everybody, we should pay attention to what's going on with global warming. Like, it's not a very interesting poem, right? And so again, the challenge is, how do you zoom in? How do you take something really, really, really big and, you don't have to write about the whole thing. You have to write about an entry point that will open up space for us to understand the whole thing, or to engage with the whole thing, right? And so, the most basic example of that, the most kind of, to an extent, maybe cliche, but also I think an illustrative example is when you're talking about the climate. I'm just using the climate crisis as a random example, but like when you talk about it through the lens of statistics, we all kind of already know that that doesn't generally sink in with most people, even people who care, even people who want to care. Rather, we can talk about stories, we can talk about images. Again, the most basic example is, don't write a poem about the climate crisis, write a poem about a mother polar bear who is nudging her cub, and they haven't eaten in a week and the cub is dead. Like, just that really like kind of melodramatic but sad but like real imagery that pulls on people's heartstrings. And I think, again, that's kind of it's a very like first draft example of what an image could be. But I think that idea of taking the thing that's big and making it small is the takeaway there, right? Maybe when you think of the climate crisis, what's a concrete thing that comes to your mind? Maybe you think of like smokestacks, right? The idea of big factories that pollute the air via smokestacks. But then like you could zoom in on that even more. Like, what do the smokestacks look like? What do they smell like? What do they remind you of? Maybe the smokestacks are like the teeth of a monster that's talking. Or maybe it's a poem that takes place 1,000 years in the future, where like archaeologists are looking at smokestacks and trying to understand what they were. And like that could be interesting. Again, there's a million different ways into that, but I think I'm repeating myself a little bit. But it starts with taking what is big and making it small, right? Taking what is abstract and making it concrete. I hope some of that makes sense. And then the other question: how do you give such depth to your poems? Depth is such an interesting term because I think it can mean different things to different people. Um, you know, Part of it is depth in terms of substance. And again, I'm not trying to give myself compliments here, but just like taking a lot of time to think and have conversations with other people and to engage with the issues that you write about in real life so that your understanding of them does have that kind of nuance and complexity. Again, not that I'm perfect at that or anything, but it's something that I've tried to do. But then I think on a formal level too, depth comes from detail, right? And description. And I can write a love poem and you can write a love poem and 1,000 other people can write love poems and 1 billion other people can write love poems. But what makes your love poem different from all those other ones? What's the thing that like helps it to stick out? I think, that's another maybe way of conceptualizing that term depth. And I think that's a fun challenge. It's hard. It's a fun challenge though, in that it forces us like, how can I write about this thing that everyone's already writing about, but just put my own spin on it? And I think some of that comes from what is personal to us. Like, if I tell my story, it's going to be different from other people's stories just because I'm an individual human being, right? And so sometimes it's what is personal, and sometimes it's the opposite of that. It's making something really, really weird, right? Like trying to think of a concept or an angle or a hook that's just bizarre and outside the box. That's part of where the book came from. But I think that depth question, I think both of those are kind of entry points into that. But then a lot of it too, and on a very real level, for any of you out there who are aspiring or emerging poets yourself, as we all are, I also think the idea of depth comes from not just from me thinking really deeply about things, but from community, right? Like having friends who will give me feedback on poems, going to an open mic or virtual open mic, which I will talk about in a minute, but a virtual open mic and like getting feedback from people. And I think that really helps add depth to poems too. Getting out of our own heads and thinking about poetry as more of a communal, collective effort, not just a deeply individual effort. Wow, there's a lot of poetry questions, which I was not really expecting. Usually, I'm so used to doing work where it's like the poetry is almost secondary. Like I get brought to the college to talk about like social justice through the lens of poetry, or talk to the football team about consent through the lens of poetry. But we actually get to talk about poetry, which is cool. How do you approach rhyme and meter in your writing? Perhaps this is naive, but it seems less emphasized in modern spoken word compared to rigid structure of classic poetry. Definitely, that's a really good observation, and it's something that I won't say struggle with, but have just thought a lot about, and that I think coming up in the spoken word world and like the slam poetry world, rhyme seemed like it was around a lot and then it kind of fell off. And I think part of that is this weird conception people have about rhyming poetry being like more basic, which, you know, those of us who write rhymes know that rhyming poetry is not inherently like basic. That's like a silly thing to think. But I do think that there's like a stereotype out there about that. Um, and personally, I think of it as just a tool in the toolbox, right? Half the stuff I write rhymes, half the stuff I write does not rhyme at all. In this book, there are. I won't go off too much on a tangent here because I want to get to the cover reveal too. But this book is very much about hip hop, even though that term is never used in the book. But it's about things like the cipher and the circle and collectivity and graffiti and dance and like all the deeper kind of fundamental pieces of the culture. Um, and rhyme to me like fits into that in that there are a number of pieces that are basically just like bars, right? That are just verses, rap verses, but they're decontextualized, and so that was really fun. And I think like the rhyming poems do something that the non-rhyming poems don't do, and then sometimes I think the non-rhyming poems do something that the rhyming poems don't do, and it's just again different tools. Um, I don't think so much about meter and rhythm in that sense, more in like a jazz sense of just what as a performer, like what feels right off coming out of my mouth, and then like what fills space in an interesting way. Um, but yeah, so I mean, you know, I don't really have advice or anything. There's actually a piece in the book called "All Advice is Bad Advice," including the advice that all advice is bad advice. And so there's a whole section of the book about like giving people advice. But if I did say anything there, I would say just, you know, write what feels fun and generative and beautiful to you. But it's also good to challenge ourselves too. Like if all you ever write is rhyming stuff, maybe try something that doesn't rhyme. If all you ever write is non-rhyming or like kind of traditional slam poetry 3-minute poems, like try doing something weird like a sonnet. You know, that can be really fun. I'm getting a little backwards on here. And yeah, and that are your prose. Like if you read my first book, like I'm a very prosy poet, for better or worse. I try not to overthink that. Yeah. So Seymour or Adam in here is talking about the idea of the griot and the storyteller. So much of the book is built around that idea, and not just of the griot themselves as someone who travels and like tells stories, but in the idea of kind of the circle, right? The open mic. Like again, there are no microphones because this is a pre-industrial society, but like the idea of the open mic is very, very present in the book, in that it's a communal space where we all come together to tell our stories. And yeah, there may be someone who does it professionally or whatever, but it's really about all of us telling our stories and just how vitally important that is. Um, and yeah, there's actually a whole section in the book on like how to host an open mic. So some of the stuff is really, really down to earth basic stuff, but it's also important. And then really quick, I'm going to get to the cover reveal. I do want to address the question about advice for anyone who's kind of an aspiring or emerging poet. And, you know, obviously the book goes there. Obviously I don't have time to like talk through all that, but I'm going to share a link. I have all this stuff right in front of me. This is a link to a little zine or collection of links and resources that I wrote for like aspiring or emerging poets. And hopefully that can be useful to you, the person who asked that question, or anyone else who just wants to check it out. It's funny, I am Button Poetry right now. I could do all kinds of stuff and mess up their page if I wanted to. But I won't, because they're doing me a favor here. Yeah, so I hope that link can be useful. All kinds of links to different ways to think about that question about, you know, I wrote it as like when I was 17, 18, just getting into poetry for the first time, just getting into spoken word and slam for the first time. What are the things I wish I had known? And that's kind of stuff that's in there. But yeah, let's do the cover reveal. So as we approach this cover reveal in the next minute, another kind of special secret about this book is that it has pictures, right? And like, I love, you know, multimedia stuff, and always had some ideas about wanting illustration or some kind of like supplementary visual art element in the book. But I want to do it also with a lot of care and intentionality. And I ended up doing like months and months of research. looking at a bunch of different artists, looking at like people's portfolios online, comparing and contrasting different styles. Slytherin cup, where? Sorry, I get distracted by the comments a little bit. Um, I don't think it is. Whatever you're looking at, if it's behind me. But so yeah, I was looking at all these portfolios. There's so many incredibly talented visual artists and digital artists in the world, and sometimes like on Twitter or on Instagram they'll do kind of like this month like everyone's like hashtag my portfolio, like that's not it, but like something like that, and you can click on that hashtag and see 100 or 1,000 really really amazing artists, and I came up with a list of so many cool people, and then I found this artist named Casper Fahm, and it was just like immediately struck because there's all kinds of really cool art out there, but Casper's art wasn't just good. It was like what I saw in my head when I was thinking about the book, when I was thinking about the characters and the scenes. And so I ended up just getting in touch with Casper, and I think there are 16 images in the book, and they're all really really cool. And so not like every single poem has a picture in it, but like there's 16. They're really great. You can see a couple. I posted a few kind of early as a preview at this link, which I'm putting in the chat box right now. And then obviously the cover too. Casper didn't design the entire cover, but the cover is built around one of their illustrations. So let's take a look. I know this probably won't look great. I was gonna share my screen, but Facebook's kind of like their what's it called? Just software or whatever just isn't really what it could be. So I'm gonna just show like this like hard copy version here, and then I'm gonna share a link in the chat box too, where you can see it, the digital version. And then of course after this event I'll change my Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and blah blah blah. But yeah, let's unveil. So again, the book, I know it's a little the book is called Not a Lot of Reasons to Sing But Enough, and if you can see the image there, then let me share the link. It'll probably be easier to see as a link than as me holding up a glossy piece of paper. So I think this is the link to the pre-order page, which I shared earlier, and of course the pre-order page had the special preview to the image. But the image was exciting to me because so the character who's depicted there is Jair, who's one of the characters in the book. But in terms of like the composition of the drawing, I sent Casper all these old R&B albums, stuff like Donny Hathaway and Otis Redding, Al Green, Smokey Robinson, Sam Cooke, stuff like that. And so many of those album covers, way back in the 60s and 70s would just be like someone like singing like this. Right, and you can see it in this image. I think the Donny Hathaway live album, maybe a little bit of the Dock of the Bay vinyl by Otis Redding, maybe a little bit Aretha Franklin's Soul Sister album, even stuff like CCR, like Creedence Clearwater Revival, their like greatest hits. Again, it's just like someone going like, but like I wanted to see if we could capture that kind of vibe, but with a robot. Right? Because, again, the whole like robot thing in the book, it isn't super present. It's kind of just some people are robots and like that's fine. Like it's not like a metaphor for racism or anything like that. It's just that some of the characters happen to be robots. And I just love how Casper was able to capture that. And like again, all the art in the book does cool stuff like that, and that's exciting. And then, as at least one person in the chat now already knows, I've also commissioned a bunch of other art that isn't in the book, but we're going to use for other maybe special goodies if you pre-order the book, which I won't talk about just yet, but eventually we'll announce that. But there's some really, really, really cool art by a range of different artists with very, very different styles that we're going to be releasing over the next, few months. I will also share in the chat box Casper's website. Just so people can see like the rest of their work, and it's really, really, really good. And I feel super lucky. It's like working with, back when I was doing more MC stuff, like working with producers, like a Seymour Perspective or Big Cats, when like the beat would be so cool, you'd want to actually kind of like, I'd feel self-conscious. I'd be like, oh, I need to write something better for this. And then seeing the art, it kind of did that a little bit too. So yeah, I'm thinking, I'll share another poem and we'll do some quick shout outs, but then if people have questions and stuff, I want to go back to Seymour's question here. So I'm really so this is what in the chat Adam said. I'm really curious how you feel you've appealed to activist spaces where at its most quote unquote ideologically pure or whatever feels that art is a waste of time when you need to be furiously reading and writing manifestos or starting the revolution. Not to be so dismissive, but there is a dismissive attitude toward artists, and I'm just curious about how an artist such as yourself connects to those spaces. Does that make sense? I would ask you the same question, right? Because I know you, and there's so much cool stuff there. Um, but just we're only here for a little bit. I can answer that for myself. it's it's hard. It's a layered question, right? Because I think there is more of a sense, at least in my experience right now in the year 2021, I think there is more of an attitude of like, yes, culture shifting is an important part of organizing, right? That like the narrative aspect, the storytelling aspect, the artistic aspect of movement work matters and matters a lot and is a huge part of how change actually happens. But I know that like in more specific spaces, that attitude isn't always there. I know that temporarily, like over the past 20 years, there have been times where that attitude hasn't always been there. Um, I guess what I'm saying is I'm a little bit optimistic about that. I think that attitude is maybe going away a little more. That idea that like, oh, you're just writing poems. Like we're trying to start the revolution. But at the same time, so the book deals with a lot of kind of both ands around that. In that a huge message in the book is that like art and poetry, and all that stuff, like they do matter and they do have an enormous impact on like movement work and movement building and organizing and trying to build a better world. And they're not magic, right? Like writing poems about stuff doesn't magically change people's minds and doesn't like do the work that needs to be done. And I think acknowledging both the power of art and the limits of art is like an interesting thing to talk about. And that's a huge part of the book is looking at the spaces where those maybe are in tension with each other. Um, even the characters kind of have, or one of the characters has kind of a crisis of faith. And they're like, why am I walking around like singing songs and writing poems? Why don't I just like be a full-time organizer? Why don't I just join the movement? And again, like it's not an easy yes or no question. Like you're wrong or you're right. Like there are elements of that question that I think are really, really important to grapple with for myself as someone who is, an artist slash activist or whatever. But then there are also ways in which maybe that question is not the whole question, right? Or it's too narrow of a focus. And again, the book kind of walks through all that stuff. Um, yeah, but yeah, we can have a conversation about that sometime. That would be great if we catch up. But is there a good way to pre-order to Canada? Shipping internationally from Button is quite pricey. Yeah, I was gonna apologize. I guess it's not my fault, so I shouldn't apologize for it. But like right now, the book is really only available through Button because it's the pre-order stage. I don't know if that changes with something like Bookshop. It's like bookshop.com or whatever, where it's like it's a network through independent bookstores. You can still get it. Like I know Button doesn't only ship through themselves. They also have partnerships with like local bookstores and stuff like that. Some of that stuff might not just be set up yet. Um, I shouldn't say stuff I don't know anything about. I don't do any of the distribution, but there may be other options. Maybe not for pre-ordering, but there may be other options when it comes to just like getting the book when it's released. But yeah, and I see the comment too. I feel that art sparks a flame and action keeps it fanned, if that makes sense. That's a cool way to think about it. The idea that like a poem or a song could maybe be an entry point into a deeper engagement. But then if all there is that poem or that song, then yeah, that's not gonna like do the thing. That idea of the both and that makes a lot of sense to me. I appreciate that comment. Cool. And yeah, I mean, just that question about pre-ordering. I know it is only October and the book doesn't come out till March. It's maybe a little early to do like a preview and a cover reveal and all that kind of stuff. But I just, I was impatient. I really liked the cover and I wanted to show it to people, basically. And again, hopefully over the next few months, we'll be sharing a bunch more stuff from the book. Um, but yeah, I think I will try to wrap up fairly soon in the next, 5-10 minutes. I figured I'd maybe share one more piece from the book, just for there's not a ton of people in the chat right now. Oh yeah, I'll see you. I'll see. I'm like waving to a person in the chat box, but yeah, I'm sure we'll catch up. Appreciate you. um, so here's the thing. I thought maybe I'd share one of the weirder poems, in that, this book is a little all over the place. There are definitely some poems that could be considered the kind of like traditional slam poems. And what I mean by that, because obviously, like, definition wise, a slam poem is a poem that is performed at a poetry slam. But like, I mean more traditional, like the general trends and themes and formulas that slam poems use. There are some poems in this book that kind of follow those, because I think those are fun, right? I love poems that have like a cool arc and are 3 minutes long and make the audience yell. And then there are other poems that do not follow that formula at all. Um, and the poems that are never going to like go viral and get shared by thousands of people, but which I think what they do is they add to the larger story that the book is trying to tell. It's very much a huge theme in the book is the idea of contribution versus like domination. The idea that as individuals, but even as individual poems in a book, we contribute something, and that thing doesn't have to be the whole thing, but it can be a piece of it. So this is one of those weirder poems, but I think it captures something that the book is about, and it captures the spirit of the book really well. So yeah, this is called Wireless It Might Scream. It's in 3 parts. 1. Not for all, but for many, some signal remains. After the body is gone or gone enough, this signal buzzes and burns and flies in every direction at once. Wireless, it might scream or laugh or soar in silent contemplation. I don't know if it's the same for humans, but for us, even when our bodies are broken, our individual personalities extinguished, our memories erased or just forgotten, this other piece can be. Sometimes it disappears, sometimes it doesn't. In one village, we came upon a necromancer. In a crumbling stone tower, he used wood and wire, bamboo and iron to craft bodies for this essence. Someone, somewhere had taught him a music. He built and played this music, built and kept playing, and eventually, like moons gathering in orbit around a world, signals began to dance around his tower. Whether they were bored or lonely or just curious, some danced right into the bodies he built, and the bodies would then dance too. Free to come and go as they pleased, the signals would dance, disappear, reappear, dance again. This was many years ago. A momentary intermissioning halfway through a much larger story. We camped for a night just outside the tower. Our captain dined with the necromancer. We only heard his music, and it felt like home. 2. When people ask, why does poetry matter? There are 1,000 answers, and most of them are bullshit. Here is one that is not. Poetry is translation. You take an emotion, an idea, a concept, and you turn it into an image, a memory, a story. You take a signal, and you build it a body. This is obvious. You already know that a message is generally more effective when it is wrapped up in a story, but there is a deeper truth here. It isn't just the specific metaphor that matters. It's the mechanics of metaphor itself. Being able to see something through some other thing. Understanding the connection, the conversation between what is large and what is small, what is far away and what is close. What is you and what is not you. Too many do not. In another village, we meet a man who denies abusing his wife for decades because he never struck her. He could not understand violence beyond physical harm. In another village, the town guards kill a child who had stolen an apple and ran. When confronted about the disproportionate response to the crime, their response is that the child should not have run. They could not understand morality beyond obedience. In another village, we find a community decimated by a highly contagious sickness. The people loved one another so much, and they could not understand connection beyond proximity. In another village, every leadership position is held by men. All the wealth is controlled by men. All decisions are made by men for over 2 generations. All other genders are treated as less than, as objects and never subjects. And then, when a rowdy group of young people of varying gender identities finally confront the village's ruling council about this state of affairs, the men respond, "We men have shouldered this burden for you for generations. We have provided for you, we have loved you, and this is how you repay us?" The men could not understand oppression beyond hatred. In another village, the boss has taken to scapegoating the community's newest members, recent arrivals from a nearby village experiencing a drought. He blames them for the poverty of the people, the failure of the crops, the poor weather, as if they somehow carried the drought with them. When a villager then murders 2 of these new arrivals, the boss states, "No one could have predicted this terrible tragedy." He could not understand responsibility beyond culpability. A plague of literalism, a plague of concepts poorly translated. Would more poetry solve these problems? No. Many who perpetrate harm know they are doing so. Many willfully mistranslate ideas in order to protect their own power, their own comfort. But the proper translations still matter. A story can only be challenged by another story, or a swirling murmuration of stories. I don't know if poetry matters, but this thing that undergirds poetry, this impulse to dig deeper, to make connections, to see beyond, this matters. 3. We pass the tower again as we return homeward from our story. The necromancer was gone, all of his bootleg bodies crumbled. It is possible he simply lost interest, moved on. It is possible the signals themselves lost interest, moved on. But as soldiers, we recognize the subtle topography of battle, even a quiet battle. Someone had decided that what the necromancer was doing was unnatural. Someone could not understand natural beyond familiar. No bodies, no blood, no obvious signs of struggle, but the hole where the music would have been, the signal-less silence. A sad story, but sadness is energy also. Build a body for it. Watch it dance. So yeah, it's a weird book. It's got robots and necromancers. I mean, necromancer is kind of a not the exact word there, but it was the one that felt right for that poem. But yeah, it's a pre-industrial society full of people who've been exiled from this like futuristic space age society, and so much of the book is about when you have this kind of new society of people who are basically prisoners. It's like a prison colony moon. They've been exiled from this other place. How do you build that society? And there's all so much stuff in there around like authority, around like individualism versus collectivity, around again, we talked about before, punishment versus prevention. How do we keep each other safe? How do we show up for each other in a way that is, something beyond the violence that we've known? And so, yeah, I hope people enjoy the book. It's a little all over the place. It's a little weird, but I think that's the strength of it too. It's just different, for better or worse, it's different. From my own work, but also, from other people's work too, probably. And yeah, and it's got pictures. I'm super excited about it. Again, I shared that link already. I can share it again, just for the sake of sharing it. But yeah, I appreciate people coming through, just hanging out for a little bit tonight. This video will remain, as far as I know, online for people to look at if they want to, but couldn't make it during the actual little live thing that we did. If people like the lives, like we could keep doing that. I can talk to Button, like whether it's me or there's other Button people. It could be a cool thing to like do regularly, right? I don't know. I did want to mention just a couple random shout outs as we're about to wrap up here. Again, if people have any other questions or thoughts, feel free to share them. Thank you. Pre-order a book that far out, it's like a gift to yourself because you forget about it and then you surprise yourself. Yeah. Oh, and I didn't even mention like there are two options for pre-orders. The more expensive option is that they're signed. I shouldn't say more expensive, but like one option is that they're signed. The other one is that they're not signed. So like whatever you're feeling is totally cool. But if you do want a signed special copy, and like I said, we're not announcing this just yet because some of the details need to be worked out. But I would like to put some like cool free stuff in the pre-order packages too. So it's not just the book; it's some of this cool artwork I've been talking about. And I will say before people log off, just a couple of shout outs. Um, an organization here in Minnesota, which some of you may know about, is True Art Speaks. And True Art Speaks, I'm just throwing their general website link in the chat, but one specific thing about True Art Speaks is that they run a free, all ages, weekly virtual open mic. And so if any of you out there are poets, you're looking for a place to share your work, no matter where you are in the country or in the world, it's every Thursday night, 7 o'clock p.m. Central Time. And again, it's free, it's all ages, it's a space you can come and just share a poem you've been working on, or just sit and listen to other people. It's also a space where people can give each other feedback, which is really cool. But yeah, you can find the information for the Reverb open mic through that link that I just shared in the chat box. Oh wow, thank you. Oh yeah, there is an audiobook. I definitely spent a couple days recording the audiobook version of this a few days ago, so that'll be coming at some point too. Also, I mean, again, for anyone who's in Minneapolis, I would be remiss if I did not mention that it is also election season. I shared a bunch of my like links and resources and notes on all the platforms, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, if anyone's still looking for stuff about that. Another quick shout out is that, again, I know there's not a ton of us sitting here, but if anyone is watching this now or watches it later, I know there's that note earlier about Canada too, about like, where are you touring or traveling? And I'm definitely like always open. You can always, at my website, GUANTE.info, there is a booking tab. You can always get in touch about booking me, whether that is an in-person thing or virtual thing. I'm trying to do a lot more virtual stuff this winter. So again, if you are at a high school or a middle school or a college, communications class or a gender and sexuality class or a sociology class or a creative writing class, a poetry class, like any of those types of spaces, I would love to come and talk. Particularly if it's virtual, it's super easy to schedule. We can make it happen pretty easily. And so there's a booking link at my website, and you can always feel free to be in touch. We can always talk about, budget stuff or like logistical stuff. We can always figure stuff out. But yeah, that would be great. Yeah, any last thoughts or questions before we wrap up? It has been about an hour. Oh, this must be what people were talking about earlier. It's not a Slytherin cup. It's a Roseau Rams cup. I did a poetry residency at the high school up in Roseau, Minnesota, which is like a couple of miles south of the border with Canada. It's way up there. And they gave me this really cool mug. I've been using it to this day. I could see why someone would think it's a Slytherin mug, though. Although I don't know what that says about me and how people see me. I'm very nice. I mean, not that Slytherins can't be nice. I'm not going to go on this tangent right now. But yeah, I think we'll wrap up here. Like I said, we're going to be releasing more stuff from the book. Maybe might do some more live stuff. Might do some Instagram live stuff later. All that kind of thing. I'm about to go and change all my like pinned posts and some of my banners on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. Just to now that we have the new cover revealed, I want to be able to spread it far and wide. I'm just really happy with it. I'm excited for you to read my poems, but also to see Casper's artwork. It's gonna be cool. So yeah, thank you again so much for being here, and I will shut it off now. Feel free to be in touch later.